back in the early 90s, we had the emergence of strong emergence of animal rights groups, targeting particularly the layer industry, which was the first industry that I worked directly with. And I also worked for a company that had German ownership, and I started seeing not animal rights, but animal welfare guidelines and legislation coming out from Europe. And I was in the primary breeder business, and we exported birds throughout the world. Hence, I became sensitized to the fact that beyond animal rights, we also had animal welfare moving in. And that helped me have the foresight that I needed to get involved in animal welfare because I knew what was coming. And this is back in the early 90s. And about everything I thought would happen has had happened. And when you love something and you lose it or you see it deconstructed, you go with what I call the stages of mourning. And I swear, it applies to about anything that you love. When you see it affected, deconstructed, or dying, you go through all these stages. And you know, the first one is denial, the second one is anger. And I was really angry when I started seeing all these things trying to deconstruct and criticize and affect the industry that I love so much. But the last stage is acceptance. And it took me a while to figure out that, yes, at some point you're going to have to accept changes in an educated way. And then the best thing I can do is to help educate people within my industry and outside to accept in some degree these changes or understand these changes. So I will start my discussions about animal welfare, housing with ethics. I have worked now, as I said, in animal welfare since the early 90s, and I was lucky enough to work in organized vet medicine and in committees. And in the second half, I started working with behaviorists and ethicists as part of these committees, and it's been a great experience, and it's has helped me a whole lot. And ethics, you know, in general, it's a guidelines for a person or group that guides their behavior. You know, versus good versus evil, right versus wrong. There's a hierarchy of ethics. The overarching hierarchy is social ethics. We all operate under the social ethics of where you live or your social group. And after that, in my case, I have professional ethics. That will be number 2. Since I'm a veterinarian, I operate under professional ethics. And then comes the personal. This is where you're from, who you are. Everything that you are is your personal ethics. Now, social ethics being the overarching principle, and going back to Camden's, the ethical consumerism, I mean, that's social ethics. At the end, I had a very wise man basically sum it up, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, when the ethics of animal use change, things must change. And they have. And we're seeing it as the whaling industry, the fur seal industry. I mean, I find whaling totally unacceptable. But I can go to a hatchery, a processing chicken plant. I go to a multi-million layer facility, and I'm like a pig in swill. I mean, I'm happy there. This is my environment. Now, take somebody else in there. So put yourself in their eyes. That's very important. Now, the animal-human bond. I went to Purdue University. Actually, we had some of the first center of the human-animal bond centers there. We also had a cancer center, and we started working a lot with the stages of mourning and the human-animal bond. And the fact is that we do bond with chickens. I grew up with chickens in my backyard. I had chickens before I had dogs, okay? And I had some very likable chickens. I also had some very unlikable birds. I had a rooster. I had to come up with a stick to grab the feeder and the water because he was the meanest rooster I ever had. I did nothing to it. He was just mean from hatch, I think, right? But I also had roosters that were extremely likable. So I spent 14 years of my career in Texas. So she's the cowboy boots. And over there, I would say the first 7 years, it was all industry. The second half, I started spending a lot of time with people that were buying chickens, and now they were bonding. You know, I had college students drive 2 hours to my lab with their dead rooster crying. Why did it die? Then I'll get the calls, people trying to help me to save their birds, not to bring them once they're sick or dead to the diagnostic lab, but actually for me to help them to save them. And that's because people develop strong bonds with their chickens. And then this is the other phenomenon that has emerged, which I call the urban chicken phenomenon, where people now in urban centers are buying chickens for egg production, etc., because they want their own eggs. And in these urban centers, we have things like this practice. This is actually a sign at the veterinary school in Raleigh, North Carolina, where they were advertising the tour de coop, where all these people are going to meet and visit these other chicken coops, which for a veterinarian is a nightmare, right? So they're all raising chickens, and they're going to go visit each other. Ooh, that's just a nightmare, right? But that's the way it was. Urban chicken production is protected by ordinance in Raleigh and Cary, North Carolina. So people can have chickens in their backyard, and they do. But unfortunately, some of these people don't have an idea what they're doing. So a lot of these birds ended up in my lab, or the calls came into the lab when their chickens started dying, getting sick, or not producing eggs, which they wanted in the first place. Now, ethics and housing. So I grew up going to these old-fashioned zoos and seeing some pet collections, like pet bird collections, and this, you will consider this normal, seeing a macaw or a parrot in a single cage by itself, its whole life. And that was totally right and acceptable. And to this day, that is still acceptable by society, to many members of our society. But the more, I always like birds, and the more you dwell into this, I mean, these are extremely social animals. They actually fly in pairs, they feed communally, they roost in the same tree all night, all of them together. And here we have this bird spending his whole life by itself in a cage. By the same token, when it comes to the poultry industry, the battery cages have become socially unacceptable, okay? But somehow, cage-free perhaps is more acceptable now, right? Based on the trend. So here you have the comparison. When I started with this talk, which I gave a year ago at NAMI, I only had this bird and the battery cages. But now I had to add this one as a right? Because that's what we are being told to do as an industry to produce more cage-free eggs, okay? So confinement and housing. So the history of alternative housing, you have to talk about confinement. Why have we evolved to confine our birds? Basically, and everything has pros and cons. So we're talking about environmental controls, basically keep them as close to ideal temperature and control nutrient quality and intake. The parallels with the swine industry are uncanny, okay? So we do the same things. When we house birds, we confine birds, it's a lot about controlling their environment, controlling nutrient quality and intake, because after all, they're food animals, in this case, whether it's meat or eggs. We isolate them from wild birds. Where do avian diseases come from? They come from birds. So if you separate your chickens from any other kinds of birds, chances are that you will have less disease challenges. And the nightmare scenario, which you probably all were well aware of, is avian influenza, that when it comes in and it attacks a naive flock, you have dire consequences, with the extra consequence now that some of these avian influenza viruses infect and kill people. Protection from predation, health in the sense we are improving health by having monoculture chickens by themselves, in confinement, with vaccination programs, with medication programs, behavior restrictions. As a matter of fact, that could be a positive when it comes to a chicken. So in behavior and animal welfare, we talk about eustress, good stress, and bad stress, right? Good stress and bad stress. The fact is that in some of our confinement practice, and I'll talk about battery cages, we are creating very stable social structure. The birds are actually less stressed in these small, stable groups than they are in these larger groups. Decreased stress, again, that's because of environment, nutrition, etc. The cons is litter manure management. When birds come, particularly floor birds, in contact with their feces, now you have more fecal-oral transmission of diseases. You have ammonia generated from the bacterial action on that manure. You have fecal dust now with the manure drying ventilation and nipple drinkers. We had drier environments, now we have a lot of fecal dust in poultry environments. When it comes to health, again, it's a large number of birds confined to a particular facility. If a disease comes in and they're not immune to it, you're going to have a lot of sick birds. Behavioral restrictions. This is big as it relates to housing. When you have birds in a battery cage, they cannot forage, they cannot nest, they cannot scratch, and there's some increased stress related to, and I will show you about group size. Now, a key driver of commercial egg production facilities has always been the production of clean and unbroken eggs. So you can all relate to this. When you go to the supermarket to buy eggs, what is the first thing that you do? You open the carton, don't you, right? If you see a broken egg, you probably will not buy it. If you see those free range eggs, if you go to a live market in Asia, you're gonna see a lot of dirty eggs, and that's the norm for them. That's not the norm here, okay? So basically we want clean, unbroken eggs, and guess what? That drove design. So when you look at the cage system, what you see is basically that the eggs roll out of the cage and they go into an automatic system. We take those eggs away from the hen as soon as possible so they don't break them and they don't defecate on them, okay? And whether you're talking about battery cages or FloorType system, you still have an automatic collection system. We want to get those eggs out of there as soon as possible for many reasons, which relate to cleanliness, food safety, and breakage, and have more sellable eggs. And my question is society at large aware of this? I mean, we're not designing these houses just because, right? There is a reason behind it. And when they're asking us to deconstruct some of these things, they have to understand the consequences of those changes. So as far as housing, we have the battery cage systems. We have over 90% of our birds in the United States in these battery cages. And I'm showing here some space requirements or space guidelines. And in the US, we're basically working from anywhere from 67 to 86 square inches of usable space per hen. When I started as a poultry veterinarian, we had hens at 48 square inches, at 48. That was tight, okay? Have we improved since the early 90s? Of course we have. In other words, we do evolve. We have to, because we're in the business of selling meat and eggs, and guess what? Sometimes the buyer dictates what you want. So we do have to change and evolve, and we have. So cage-free systems, we're talking about aviaries. Now we're giving them more space, like 1 square foot in litter, in a multi-tier, 1 square foot per hen. Semi-confinement, these are mostly the organic birds. They have to have, by law, the organic law in the United States, they have to have access to the outside. And the American Humane has a standard, the outdoor access, we should provide about 5.45 square feet per hen. When you go to pasture, AHA says about 27 square feet per hen. In the European recommendation, about 43 square feet per hen. So these are different systems. The battery cage system, here I'm showing you the ultimate development of this, right? So I grew up seeing all kinds of makeshift battery cages, designs, and I believe this is the ultimate evolution of it. It's basically a vertical stack with manure belts in between, but again, they have the same features that have all along. You have a feed trough, you have a manure belt, and you have watering system. And you have a slanted floor for those eggs to roll out and being collected automatically to have clean and unbroken eggs. Now, these houses have grown to massive sizes. And sometimes this is land availability, water availability. You try to maximize the productivity. These places have a relatively small footprint, but there's a lot of birds in that house. Now, we have been sensitized as an industry when people call us factory farms, right? But guess what? If I have a consumer going into one of these facilities, I can see what they're going to think about it, right? It does look like a factory, right? It does look like a factory. But this is the ultimate. Tunnel ventilated house, vertical tiers, manure handling systems, automatic inline egg collection. So, in some of these ultimate houses, you have sometimes 500,000 birds in there, 12 cage tiers per row in 2 floors. So in other words, you have a walkway between tiers 6 and 7. So 2 stories, 500,000 birds in battery cages. And everything works quite well. I mean, when you have that many birds, you have to control that environment very carefully because they can overheat real quick and you can kill a lot of birds. So we do take care of them, automatic alarms, all kinds of monitoring systems. We have people walking the houses every day. The birds that we have today were bred to function in the system. They're basically, their ultimate prerogative is to lay eggs with a good shell in them. And sometimes they will sacrifice their bodies. The battery cage environment, which has low exercise and things of that nature, helps them to fulfill that genetic prerogative of producing eggs every day, moving 3 grams of calcium every day for that eggshell, okay? And we had this all figured out. Now, social ethics have told us now it's like we need to change the system to something different, right? And guess what? We're still working with the same genetics, with the same genetic prerogative for egg numbers and shell quality, okay? Enriched cages. So this became the middle of the road thing, and it was not a bad thing. Dictated, again, started in Europe with guidelines and legislation. Now we can have 20 to 72 hens per compartment. But here is one of the things that I'll talk about is group size. When it comes to group size, the smaller the group of birds, the more stable the pecking order, the less stress they have. Now, as far as space, in enriched cages, the European recommendation is 116 square inches per hen, and actually that's what was started to be implemented also in the US guidelines. So in a diagram form, let's see here what this means. So in battery cages, you have these compartments, or you have, let's say eight hens per compartment. This was a very stable, it is a very stable social pecking order when they go to the trough and all that. As a matter of fact, people start measuring cortisol levels, things of that nature, with some of the first parameters we did for stress. We see that there's less stress here. Next to that will be the colony cage. Now you take all the partitions and you have all the birds in that environment. This is an enrichable or colony type cage. It's a barren environment. Now you have a very large group with kind of unstable pecking order. What we learned is from, even before I became a poultry veterinarian, Southern California, we had 60 bird colony cages. That's where we started learning about hysteria, right? Hens going hysterical, right? So you have a barren environment with an unstable social order, and basically what you end up with is birds are so stressed that they will actually jump all the time, hurt themselves when they get in the cage, pile to one end, basically kill themselves, hysterical. I mean, actually, literally hysterical. So there's such thing as hysteria in birds. When does it happen? Usually in colony cages. So we went from the battery cage to the enrichable when the US industry thought that the future will be the enrichable cage. But we started seeing the impact of that large number of birds in a cage, the hysteria type environment. Now, what does the enriched cage do? You still can have up to 60 birds, but now you have a nest and you have perches. There's some degree of avoidance of that aggression here, right? They can go to a different level. Perhaps they can go to the nest and hide. So you avoid some of the issues that you have with the colony or enrichable cage. So the enriched colony cage, again, what does it do? It provides nest area, scratch pad. Everything else is the same. It's all about clean, unbroken eggs. You have manure belt, manure collection. Now, it also fulfills a strong behavioral prerogative of the hen, which is nesting, right? And perching, right? Those are two things that birds do like. And behaviorists have studied this, and they do time budgets, and they show preference, just like Tom talked about preferences in sows. We do know what hens want to have and do, chickens in particular. But enriched cages just look like a battery cage system, right? When you go in there to house the same number of birds, it's exactly the same thing. You just took partitions away, you added nest, you added perches, scratch pad. But with those houses, don't look much different from a battery cage. Now the performance in enriched cages, some people started implementing whole houses or half a house when we thought we were gonna go this way. And the performance compared to standard is very similar. A little bit more feed consumption, there's more activity in those cages, so some of the nutrients that will go for basically production now go into some body maintenance because they're a little bit more active. But the productivity, a lot of the parameters were actually good in enriched cages. And we were providing some of the things that they wanted and they liked, so we were improving their welfare. The MultiTier cage-free aviary. So now that we go cage-free, in Europe they started developing these aviaries, multi-tier aviaries, which basically, when you look at the design, is basically taking the doors away from a cage system and now having the chickens having the ability to go up and down that multi-tier system, and then you add a floor space in between those tiers so they can actually do some scratching and do some of their natural behaviors in that floor area. But basically, it is a cage system where you take some of the partitions out. The challenge with this system is that if the birds don't grow in this system, if you don't grow those brood and grow those pullets in the same system, when they go here, they're not trained. The other thing to use it, the other thing is that, again, the more freedom we give them to express natural behaviors, there are some negative behaviors that come into play. And one of the things with this one would be piling. In that floor area, they migrate where the light is. And some of these tiers, you have to divide the floor area with actually a partition. So now you have multi-tier partitions, and now you have partitions in between segments. And when you go into these houses, all the birds are piling to the front of that floor area. Why? Because you have light in that pre-room to the cages. Why? Because that's where you have the egg escalators, you have a lot of equipment, a lot of the monitoring systems are there. So it's a well-lit area for the workers. But you go in that house, all the birds are piled against that partition towards the light, which the birds will do. They move towards the light. We also have more floor eggs. Any dark spot where they can hide, they start actually clutching and trying to sit on their eggs. The FloorType Aviary, this was first implemented in Europe when they went cage-free. Multi-tier, you have floor, and then you have slats. Issues in this there's a couple of issues with this. This is where a lot of the initial issues with parasitism, high cannibalism, mortality, bone fractures, and the other thing is like really horrible worker conditions. Because for them to work in the system and reach the birds and fix things, it's really, really rough. And that's where in Europe they evolved from the multi-tier aviary system to FloorType to the multi-tier cage system, taking the partitions out. And then you have free-range layers. So basically they are pasture birds. They usually have movable, the ultimate system, it's like Whole Foods wanted to do this. It's like 10 acres, 600 hens. You actually subdivide that for rotating the birds. You have a feeding station on skids you can move. You have a nesting station that you can move from rotating pastures, and you have a perching environmental shelter too. Now, again, because of productivity of the hens, we're trying to use for the most part, if you're going to produce eggs in large scale, you end up using the same genetics in all these systems. Some of these birds are not well suited for things other than battery cages. So you end up with a lot of issues. To deconstruct where we are, we have to actually, if you think about it, we have to go backwards to more robust, less productive birds. And one thing you have to understand about layers is that egg numbers relate to aggression. And this was discovered actually at Purdue University. They selected for a docile bird that you don't have to big trim, and the egg numbers went down. So there's a linkage. Let's think about it, right? If you are dominant and aggressive, you get to eat more. Hence, you can maintain your body, plus you can spare something for egg production too. So these hens, sometimes they don't do too well in these systems. Now, welfare considerations. So when I started, I took technical writing in college, and they say if you want to define something, break it into its parts and talk about the parts. So it helps me a lot to break animal welfare into its 4 basic components. Now, health goes to the top because I'm a veterinarian, right? So my professional ethics dictate that goes to the top. That may change for a behaviorist, but health is there. Biological function, this is anatomy and physiology. Natural living is their behavior, basically their natural behavior, and mental state, as the name implies, whether they are mentally stable in that environment. Now, what we're seeing, we started studying all these different housing systems, is that there are trade-offs. And the first report came out of the UK. It was called the Laywell Report on some of the trade-offs in alternative hen housing systems. And basically, they were looking at conventional cage, enriched cage, non-cage is FloorType Aviaries, and total free range. And basically, has the AVMA summarized this label report in this color table where green is good, yellow is so-so, and red is bad. And the more I started looking at their report, then I started seeing this diagonal line where basically the trade-offs are between health and natural living. The more we allow them to express their natural behaviors when we have large numbers of birds for commercial egg production, the worse their health get, right? So basically, all these reds relate to health issues, parasitism, mortality, bone fractures. Their health suffers the more freedom we give them, and this will relate to behavioral restrictions in these barren cages, which is basically nesting, perching, foraging, dust bathing, right? So basically, you have this line. The more freedom you give them, you start sacrificing health. You don't necessarily have to, but you have to understand if you're going to produce eggs in large scale, you're still going to be working with large numbers of birds. You want very productive birds, so you end up with genetics that really may not function very well in the system. And when it comes to hens, osteoporosis, an inherent bone weakness is their problem. Why? Because, as I told you before, they're mobilizing 3 grams of calcium every day to lay a really nice egg with a beautiful eggshell, okay? And they will sacrifice their bones before that eggshell quality goes down. That's the way it works, right? They do have medullary bone, which is dictated by hormones before production, and they're supposed to grab calcium from that medullary bone for the shell and keep their cortical bone stable. But guess what happens? If nutrition is off, they use all that medullary bone and they start using cortical bone for eggshell. And that weakens their eggs, so they have their bones, so they have osteoporosis, so they're more prone to injury, fractures, etc. So housing and natural living. So what are the things that these birds value, these laying hens value? And obviously nesting and perching are at the top. Foraging, dust bathing, of course, they will love to see those things, but they really value nesting and perching. And now, as they have the freedom to express their behaviors, and they will do in cages too, you have what's called aggressive pecking. Aggressive pecking, you recognize it when you see the birds because their injuries are usually to the head or their face, okay? And that's what they use to establish their pecking order, okay? Now, there's also feather pecking or body pecking, and this is when we start seeing, we call it feather pecking, you know, feather loss from birds pecking each other. And we're trying to recognize these as redirected foraging behavior. And again, when you have highly productive hens and something is missing, and then there's not much else to forage on, they start foraging on each other, right? And feathers are, you know, a source of, say, for example, sulfur, amino acids, etc. So they look at that next bird. Stretching their wings. Birds in free range, they stretch their wings. I grew up with looking at the chickens. Dust bathing, stretching their wings. And this is interesting because when Prop 2 passed in California, and I don't know if you're familiar with Prop 2, but basically the requirement was for the birds to stand up, turn around, stretch their wings, and never touch each other. Something that a battery cage will never fulfill, okay? So that's when we started talking about enriched cages. And now enriched cages are out of the question. I'll show you why. Well, some people have alluded to it already. Beak trimming. Beak trimming is central. It's central to bird housing because of behavior and because of what the beak is. The beak is an exploratory organ, is an organ for defense, for establishing a pecking order. And when we started putting all these highly productive birds together, one of the things we found out is that sometimes they will peck and they will cannibalize, okay? And that there's some genetic lines that are less aggressive than others, okay? But guess what? You know, we cannot dictate what genetics people use. Sometimes they want larger egg size, so they have to bring a different bird in. Sometimes they want, so the egg blend, the egg size is very important because the US market is a large egg market, okay? Now, that said, what we learned is that by trimming that beak, we can actually reduce some of the issues associated with that, pecking and cannibalism. So, when you beak trim, you have reduced pecking, reduced feather pulling, reduced cannibalism, better feather condition, less fearfulness, less chronic stress, and decreased mortality. Now, what are the cons of that? You have short-term pain, perhaps chronic pain. There's a neuroma formation sometimes when you have really just bad procedures, and you have the acute stress of the handling. Now, what have we done? Have we changed as it relates to big trimming? Yes, we only do it when necessary. We do have genetic lines that under total environmental control, we don't have to big trim. This is the houses that are tunnel ventilated. We can control the light, temperature, and you don't have to big trim at all. Now, there's some genetic lines and there's some housing systems where you have to big trim or you're going to be in trouble. Now, what we had done, we were big trimming many times around 10 days of age and around 10 weeks automatically, right? What we found out is based on understanding anatomy physiology, that 10-week big trimming, it was definitely more painful to the hands. And also, we were actually affecting performance too, because that handling at 10 weeks, at that stage they're growing, getting set for egg production, you actually set them back quite a bit, because they back off of feed and water, right? So guess what? We eliminated, for the most part, we have eliminated that 10-week big trim, and now we actually, as a guideline, we say 10 days or less. So the 10 days or less, now it's turning basically a lot to 1 day old, but right at the hatchery with infrared big trimming, which basically heat this up to the point that that tip of the beak dies and falls off, okay? We have the hot blade, that was standard practice. The hot blade, I mean, if it's not well adjusted, if it's not sharp, if the temperature is not right, you could end up damaging some birds for life. Housing and mental state. Again, this is what the hen values. So what we do now and what behavior starts seeing is that before oviposition, a hen in a battery cage or a bearing cage would start circling before oviposition, but it's not only the fact that they were trying to look for that nest, it's the fact they actually have more aggressive behavior before oviposition. And and this is people talk about avoid anthropomorphizing and stuff, but the fact is that there's some degree of frustration associated with the fact that they don't have a nest when they want one, okay? So guess what? The chicken next to them pays the price. And this also happens with broiler breeders during feed restriction. When you put them back, when you turn the feeders on, but somehow you keep them from accessing the feed, they will start beating each other up. I mean, they just get mad, right? I'm putting it just like they were people. Guess what? But the wiring, it's similar. So these things happen. Now, the new paradigm. So the second half of my presentation, I would have dedicated more to enriched cages and things like that, but guess what happened? The demand for cage-free eggs did away with the enriched cage as an alternative for the industry, which would have been the nice middle of the road, right? We were giving them some of their behavioral needs, but still preserving our ability to control health and the environment and other factors, and actually save them from hurting themselves because they have this inherent bone weakness, right? But social ethics have changed. There's a demand for cage-free eggs. And restaurants, food manufacturers, hotels, travel companies started switching as a policy to cage-free eggs. And basically cage-free production, not enriched cages, appear to be the future of alternative housing, alternative to battery cages. And basically we have seen a steady growth. These are statistics from the USDA, where from 2008, our total cage-free flock has gone from 3.5% to about 8.7%. We've gone from 9.8 million hens to about 24 million hens used for cage-free egg production. They're further breaking down into organic and traditional cage-free. But what we have seen is that steady growth based on demand. And this is late to 2015. But now we start thinking about this demand for cage-free production. So looking at the big picture, this is again USDA analytics here, looking at about 13 million hen used for cage-free, producing about 3.5 billion eggs. By 2025, 100 million hens, 27 billion eggs. That would be the demand for cage-free eggs. Now, the UEP estimates go a little bit above that because they're actually looking at the demand from the individual suppliers. And here they're looking at demand for restaurants, food distributors, grocers. They actually left out food manufacturers, travel, and hospitality. But still, what they say that the demand above those 100 million is more like 138 million hens, or 50% of our production by 2025 will be, or 2026 will be cage-free. And as far as the timelines, we have some that's basically the people that buy the eggs. We have some of them as early as 2017. They want to sell 100% cage-free eggs. We have some timelines stretched to 2026. Again, the parallels to the swine industry are uncanny, right? What Tom was talking about. We're talking about timelines for instituting these changes. Sometimes they're tight, sometimes they're more generous. But the common theme is that, yes, the societal ethics have changed, and they have forced us to change to do things the way we do. So because of this demand for cage-free eggs, then the next part of my presentation focuses on the health considerations for cage-free egg production. And basically, in general, when we go cage-free, there's decreased livability. Mortality goes up. Air quality, dust and ammonia can go up. The other thing is, once they go to that expression of some of their natural behaviors, then we have things like increased feather, pecking, cannibalism, the bone fractures, because in an environment where now they have to jump, fly, move around, those bones cannot take the impact of landing from a high tier to the floor, landing on a perch. Internal parasites. This is all about fecal-oral transmission of disease. So when we have them in these battery cages, guess what? The manure drops to the wire, and either goes to a manure pit, or now it goes to the egg belt. So we separated the hens from their manure. So guess what? We reduce fecal-oral transmission of diseases. Once you go to FloorType, now they have direct access to their feces again, so you're going to have more transmission of fecal-oral type diseases. In this case, things like coccidia, roundworms. You also have more places for external parasites to hide in. Just like when you have broiler houses, when you have litter, there's arthropods that like it, there's mice like it, rats like it. They like those floor houses. There's more places for them to hide, to burrow. In the case of Europe, where they moved to cage-free, if you go to Europe, they still have a lot of wooden structures. They're small houses, wooden structures. Red mites love that. Red mites hide in the wood structure. They come at night to feed on the birds, okay? Now, I don't see that happening in the US, and still hasn't happened, because red mites really started disappearing as a challenge in the US when we started building more metal structures. So the fact is, even if we go cage-free, what we're doing, we're still using tunnel ventilated, we're still using these multi-tier metal structures. Chances are that we're not gonna have that increase in red mite infestations, because we really don't provide good place for them to hide. They really like the wood structure, the crevices between trusses and the defects in the wood itself. Bumblefoot, this comes from, once they're on the floor, and basically, depending on the surfaces where there's good slats, there are poor slats, they end up hurting their feet, and you end up with chronic inflammation. Poorly designed perches, again, lead to bumblefoot. That's some of the issues that my fellow vets that work with raptors in zoological collections have to deal all the time. Poorly designed perches lead to bumblefoot. I mean, basically, the damage to that foot pad, chronic inflammation, sometimes you have a secondary staph infection in there. So we see that on the floor. We see that sometimes with poorly designed slides, broiler breeders, the males strut that's one of their natural behaviors. And in strutting, they scratch the bottom of their feet. And if you're doing that on poorly designed wood slats that has splinters, guess what? They're gonna hurt their feet, and you end up with bumblefoot. Hysteria, piling, smothering. Again, just like I said, when we were using colony cages, and when people start using these enrichable cages where you have that large colony size, and when you go to the floor with these egg layers, you have more chances of this hysteria, piling, and smothering. So what you have to start playing now is with the light structure. You really don't want them all migrating to one spot. These partitions that we're doing to keep them from going all to one end, and those partitions end up being sometimes a liability, because they're still gonna pile towards where the light is. So there's gonna be some different issues. Now, these issues are not unfounded. The fact is that the Europeans, which started instituting all this alternative housing well ahead of us, they have studied the mortality patterns in cage-free systems, and this is a Swedish study from 2009, and again, there is higher occurrence of bacterial diseases, parasitic diseases, and cannibalism, in the litter-based and the free-range systems versus the cages. And the other thing they notice is a higher occurrence of viral diseases in indoor litter-based housing systems. This is all about fecal-oral transmission. We do have viruses that use that fecal-oral transmission route, and you see an increase. Some other people already talked about the Coalition for Sustainable Egg Supply and their study, which they published recently. You had the report. looking at 3 housing systems: conventional, enriched, and aviary. And this is a consortium of multiple academic centers, the USDA, and various buyers of eggs. They established this farm in the Midwest with all 3 housing systems in the same location. And their summary report, just like that label report that I showed you that goes from green to red, the findings of this study could have been predicted. It's the same thing. So basically, you're looking at, again, conventional cage, enriched cage, and aviary. And this is negative impact, and this is positive impact. And again, the issues with CageFree is usually increased mortality, increased aggression and cannibalism, and increased kill damage. These are actual bone fractures. And this is kind of predictable, and it's going to keep being this way until we figure a way of producing as many eggs as people demand in these systems, that now the birds have to move more, jump, do all kinds of things. Plus, we're giving them the freedom to peck and unstable, these unstable pecking orders, because of the bird size and mobility. We're going to have the same consequences. The other thing, there's some impacts in egg quality in the sense of food safety. Once you go to CageFree, there's more possibility of contact of those eggs with fecal material, hence the overall number of bacteria on that eggshell do go up. And some of the bacteria may include things like Salmonella and Campylobacter, which are significant food safety concerns. Now, regardless of the prevalence of Salmonella, overall in egg production is low. We just have these sporadic large outbreaks. But the fact is, even with the low prevalence, the amount of Salmonella in the aviary system is higher. On those shells, when you culture, you have more Salmonella. Well, they have more contact with fecal material and the environment, hence you're going to have higher bacterial loads. Now, the consequence of cage-free housing is increased direct contact with the feces, which equals increased fecal-oral transmission of diseases. And basically, Salmonella is transmitted horizontally in the feces and the air, and there's some vertical transmission. There's some Salmonella that actually infect the ovary oviduct, and those eggs are laid already infected. But the fact is that increased contact of the eggs with the environment in cage-free production and increased contact with the feces will lead to increased surface contamination overall. Parasitic diseases, again, fecal-oral, as I mentioned, coccidia, roundworms, capillaria. Again, once they have access to the floor in their own feces, there's going to be more cycling of parasites. And this is the challenge in layers. A lot of the medications that are allowed in turkeys, broiler breeders, broilers, there's no established withdrawal time for eggs for human consumption. Guess what? We cannot use these drugs. So a lot of the new wormers that the broiler breeder people are using, the broilers, they don't have a label for eggs for human consumption. Antibiotics, the same thing. Very few. So we're putting them in a higher risk environment with more bacterial loads, more parasitic loads, and very few tools that we can use. So there's going to be dire consequences for those birds, okay? We're going to have increased losses. We're going to have poorer welfare as we change systems. Again, it's all about fecal oral exposure. We're talking about coccidia. We're talking about histomonas. In terms of worms, Ascaridia, Heterachis, Capillaria. Roundworms, of course, this is a really bad case of roundworms, Ascaridia. But in the old days, every so often, you will end up with a worm inside the egg, right? Because if you have a heavy load, you have to understand anatomy and physiology. Birds have a cloaca where what? The urinary, genital, and gastrointestinal tract empty into, right? So in that cloaca, basically you could have worms come out of the gastrointestinal tract and climb up the oviduct, and guess what? Once they make it to the shell gland, they get packaged inside that egg, okay? So theoretically, that could happen. This is one of those nightmare scenarios, and I'm not trying to scare you, but it can happen, and it will happen, okay? So consumer complaints may increase because egg quality may decrease. The other thing is that in all these alternative systems, we're using a lot of brown layers, okay? Why? Because brown eggs and alternative together goes to that farm fresh concept that we have in our nation, right? Brown eggs are from the farm, and the white eggs I don't know where from, but apparently not from the farm. And guess what? Brown hens genetically have more meat spots, and basically these are pieces of the oviduct that break off and they get included in the egg. So when you crack them open, you see like a bloody spot, or you actually see a meaty spot, right? So again, let's get ready for the fact that we may have more consumer complaints about funny things inside their eggs. Or they'll get used to it, right? So it's a new paradigm for everybody. Coccidiosis. Coccidiosis, again, it's terrible. It damages the intestinal tract. It opens it up to bacterial disease, but then it decreases productivity too. And it builds up in the environment. The oocysts are super resistant when they're unsporulated. They remain in that environment for a long, long time. And the more cycling, the more it builds up. So now that we have them off the cage and with more contact with their own feces, they're going to be more cycling. So guess what? We don't have a lot of good medications to use in layers. We can use them maybe in the pullet to prevent it, but this is what is happening now and what will happen in the transition. We'll still be raising pullets in cages and moving them to cage-free facilities. If you raise pullets in cages, guess what? They have no immunity because they're not cycling as many coccidia. Now you put them on the floor, now they're breaking in the lay house. If they break in the lay house, we don't have a lot of medications that we can legally use to treat them. So guess what? We're going to have coccidia outbreaks. So what is the answer to that? It's vaccination. But guess what? The vaccination takes 3 cycles of cycling in the birds for immunity to build up, and in the cage system, you have poor take because most of the feces fall through the wire. So for a while there, we may be seeing an increasing coccidiosis in cage facilities with very little for us to do, but watch them get sick, die, decrease production, okay? Possibly. It can happen. But again, we're going to have to manage that litter, manage those floor areas, and use anticoccidials in the pullet stage, and then vaccinate to build immunity and somehow find ways to improve cycling of the vaccine so that they are immune before egg production. And again, I'm showing you this is the perfect scenario. This is cage-free layers in what was designed for broiler breeders, right? You have you have a mating area, and then you have the other 2/3 are slats. That's what your feeder, your nests, everything's are. Well, right here, although you have feces falling to the slats, in this area right here, you're going to have exposure to the same parasites that broilers and broiler breeders get exposed. Your roundworms, your coccidia, in a species where we don't have a lot of things labeled to treat them. Fowl cholera, again, it's not in every environment, but when it gets in an environment, it tends to linger and it can kill a lot of birds. And where do you see it? I spent 14 years in Texas. I got to see fowl cholera even in laying hens, which is rare. But depending on the environment, once it gets there, it's really hard to get rid of. And where do you have the highest incidence? In broiler breeders and commercial layers in floor-type housing. So we may see an increase in fowl cholera. Immunosuppression, this is a study from Europe where they actually see decreased humoral response, decreased antibody response on the birds on the ground. And one of the things that affects the immune system is infectious bursal disease, which uses a fecal-oral route of infection, right? So if you have more contact with your feces, you periodically could have more IBD, damage to the bursa, hence you're going to have a decreased ability to mount an immune response. So we address this through vaccination, but you have to understand, we've been raising pullets in cages and moving them to cages. We have decreased fecal-oral transmission for years, and now we're going to be raising pullets on access to floor and having birds laying on access to floor. All these fecal-oral challenges by nature will increase, so we're going to have to address and adjust as we go along. Again, Newcastle, it could be respiratory, but it could also be fecal-oral. And again, as a Swedish study said, there is significantly higher occurrence of viral diseases in indoor litter-based housing systems. It's all about fecal-oral transmission. Pecking and cannibalism, this is from my cases. Back in Texas, I had an organic producer. And starting about 40 weeks of age, in mortality will go to 0.4% per week. That's really high, right? Anything about 0.2% per week in a layer facility is high. 0.4 is double over what we consider high. And 50% of the mortality was from vent pecking and cannibalism. The other 50% was, guess from what? From bacterial diseases, right? Colibacillosis, increased peritonitis, and salpingitis. The only way we were able to change this was to change the genetic line that he was using. So we started with a different brown bird that somehow in his environment was less willing to peck and cannibalize. It was the only way to address the issue. There was no other way. And I'm going to show you some nasty pictures from that case, right? And this is what happens with vent pecking, right? When the hen lays an egg, she actually prolapses her vagina. So that actually the eggs don't really come in contact with the cloaca and the feces in general, because she actually prolapses the vagina, the egg comes out. Now, as she does that, you have this really nice pink target for the next chickens to peck at. Now, is this going to happen every time? No. For example, a good producing hen, she usually tends to be the heaviest one. Remember, aggression, increased egg numbers, they eat more, those are your biggest hens. So if they have a nice abdominal fat pad, when they try to either prolapse or bring the vagina back, it may take them longer because of their anatomy. So now they have that target. And once they get pecked, it's inflamed. The next time it gets worse, it can get infected. And now the birds die from either septic shock, or they actually go from this to being cannibalized, but they're still alive, right? And this is a close-up. Here you see the inflammation, and now you see fibrin tags. I mean, that's the body trying to heal. This is a very acute lesion. This is part of the vagina that could not be brought back inside the body. And as you can see, once you break that skin-blood barrier and mucosa-blood barrier, now bacteria can ascend, and now you could have things like bacterial peritonitis or oviduct infections, okay? But also then being on the floor, again, there's higher bacterial loads in the houses. We cannot move the manure out like we did in the conventional cages, on the enriched cages. The manure is there. What's in the manure? Bacteria. What did we do? We instituted nipple drinkers. They created a dry environment. Now you have more fecal dust, right? So these are all consequences. Bone fracture, this is a big one. As I told you before, the prerogative here, genetic prerogative for the hens is to produce really nice eggs, large numbers of eggs with nice shell. And now we start seeing an increase in keel fractures, in bone fractures. And sometimes these are broken, healed, broken again. Really high incidences. We're seeing it in cages. Initially, people thought it was all landing on a perch. When we provide them perches and then you have weak bones, it's landing on the perch. We're finding bone fractures even in cages too. The incidence is lower, it's higher in the cage-free systems. And this is basically what you end up. This is your normal anatomy. You have the sternum here, and these are normal sternum, and these are sternum with fractures. And when you have one like this, these are multiple fractures trying to heal. So you basically have birds with chronic pain. And we rather don't have that, but we're gonna see increased incidence of that unless we change the genetics. Honestly, unless we use birds that are more robust in the systems, we're going to have issues like that. And with that, I conclude my presentation.